When I first saw him walk through our door, I didn't think anything of it. Just another one of my husband's endless family connections, this one more distant, more temporary, someone to help for a while and then forget. But that was before the glances started lingering. Before the air around us thickened like heat trapped in glass. Before the nights grew heavier than the days. I never intended to let anything happen. Not in my home. Not with someone tied, even loosely, to my husband's blood. But intentions are funny things. They can dissolve in a look, a laugh, a moment when you forget who you are and remember who you used to be. He was supposed to stay a few weeks. Help around the house, recover from his messy divorce. That was all. I told myself that every morning while pouring coffee for two men, one who looked at me like I was wallpaper, and the other like I was wildfire. I wish I could say I stopped it in time. That I saw the signs and built a wall. But I didn't. Because the truth is, something inside me wanted it. Needed it. And that's where everything began to unravel. Before I take you through what really happened, tell me, have you ever crossed a line you swore you never would? Leave a comment with the city you're watching from, and tell me, what's the one secret you tried to bury, but it just wouldn't stay hidden? The first thing I noticed was how quiet he was. Not shy, just measured. The kind of quiet that made you lean in a little closer without realizing. He didn't rush to fill silences, didn't demand attention like most young men do. He simply existed in the space, calm and aware, like he was cataloging the room with his eyes. I'd grown used to noise. The television my husband left on all evening. The constant hum of appliances. The mechanical politeness of our conversations. So when this young man, my husband's so-called adopted grandson, though the term always felt oddly formal, moved in, I expected disruption. Instead, he brought silence. And I didn't realize how much I craved that. He arrived on a Tuesday, with 2 suitcases and tired eyes. My husband introduced us with his usual careless tone, more concerned with his phone than the person in front of him. He just needs a place for a few weeks. His ex threw him out, he said, as if discussing some unwanted delivery. I gave a polite smile, already rehearsing the small talk in my head, how are you, what do you do, that sort of thing. But he only nodded, said, thank you for letting me stay, and carried his bags upstairs without fuss. At dinner, he sat to my left. Close, but not close enough to make me uncomfortable. We ate baked salmon, the way my husband likes it, overcooked, dry, no lemon. The silence stretched until my husband started complaining about a supplier delay, and I half listened while pushing food around my plate. At one point, the young man glanced at me. Not a flirtatious glance. Just steady. Curious. As if trying to place me. I caught his gaze and smiled out of reflex, then quickly looked away. It was nothing. But something about the way he returned to his food made me wonder what, exactly, he'd seen. The days settled into a rhythm. My husband went to work early, leaving me to manage the house alone. I hadn't worked in years, we agreed I didn't need to, so my hours were filled with tidying, cooking, watering the same potted plants that never quite thrived. The young man, I won't say his name, for reasons that will become obvious, offered to help. At first I refused, out of habit more than pride. But he insisted, and soon enough we were unpacking boxes in the attic, rearranging the garage, trimming hedges. I hadn't realized how much the house had been neglected. Or how good it felt to move beside someone who noticed. He wasn't overly familiar. Never crossed lines. Never hovered too long. But it was in the small things, how he'd wait for me to speak, rather than talk over me. How he listened, really listened, when I mentioned something as trivial as the water pressure in the guest shower. My husband hadn't looked me in the eyes for longer than 5 seconds in years. This boy, this man, looked without blinking. It made me feel observed, but not judged. One afternoon, I walked into the kitchen to find him cleaning the stovetop. He was wearing a white t-shirt, slightly damp from sweat, and there was a streak of grease across his forearm. "You didn't have to do that," I said. He looked up, smiled a little. "It was disgusting. Couldn't help myself." I laughed, more from surprise than amusement. Then I saw the way he looked at me, not with desire, but with recognition. As if he'd just remembered who I used to be. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed long after my husband had fallen asleep. The window was open, and the sound of wind brushing against the trees made the room feel too big. I looked down at my hands, aging, yes, but still mine, and tried to remember the last time someone touched them without prompting. I couldn't. Not recently, anyway. It wasn't romantic, what I felt. Not yet. It was something subtler. The slow warming of a room that had been cold for too long. The hum beneath the silence. I didn't feel in danger. I didn't feel shame. I felt awake. And that, perhaps, was the most dangerous part. A few mornings later, my husband left early again, rushing through breakfast with his usual distracted muttering. I was in the kitchen, scrubbing the sink, when I heard footsteps behind me. Not hurried, not hesitant. I turned. He stood there, holding a small plant, lavender, I think, and said, "I saw this at the market. Thought you'd like it." I blinked, caught off guard. "Thank you," I said, too softly. "You mentioned once your garden didn't smell like anything anymore," he added. I didn't remember saying that. Or maybe I did, in passing. A complaint half-muttered while deadheading flowers. But he remembered. And that mattered. Later, I placed the lavender on the windowsill. Its scent drifted faintly when the breeze blew through. I stared at it for a long time, then touched one of the tiny blooms, pressing it between my fingers. My pulse quickened, inexplicably. I wasn't falling in love. Let me be clear about that. I was too old, too experienced, too tethered to my reality. But I was beginning to see a crack in the walls I'd built. And through that crack, something moved, quiet, patient, real. It's funny how something so small can grow without notice. A second glance. A gesture. A scent. You tell yourself you're imagining things. That you'd never let it go further. That you know better. And maybe you do. But knowing better doesn't always save you. Not when you've already started to feel. The next few days unfolded like a strange rehearsal of normal life. I went about my routines, careful not to let anything seem different, though everything inside me felt permanently altered. I folded towels the same way I always had. I watered the plants. I made sure the dishwasher was loaded correctly, that my husband's shirts were ironed just so. But beneath every motion was the steady throb of memory, of that moment, of the quiet intensity that passed between us. I told myself it wouldn't happen again. That it had been a lapse in judgment, a brief betrayal of my character, a flicker of weakness brought on by loneliness and proximity. But even as I repeated those words in my head, they felt like someone else's voice, distant and unsure. He was careful too. Kept his distance. Didn't linger in the kitchen or ask if I needed help with errands. But when we passed in the hallway, or stood beside each other at the sink, something passed between us, some invisible thread, pulled tight and humming. One morning, my husband rushed out early again. I stood by the window, watching his car disappear at the end of the street, and felt a strange emptiness in my chest. Not grief. Not regret. Just the quiet confirmation of something I had long suspected: he didn't see me anymore. Not really. I could disappear from the house, and he'd probably notice only when the laundry stopped folding itself. Around mid-morning, I walked into the living room and found the vacuum left in the middle of the floor. I bent down to roll it away and winced as my back spasmed. It wasn't the first time. The ache had crept up slowly over the years, deepening like roots beneath the skin. I pressed a hand to my lower spine, straightened with effort, and made my way to the kitchen. He was there, barefoot on the cold tiles, pouring coffee. He looked up when I entered, and his expression shifted barely, but enough to tell me he saw something in my face. "You're back," he asked softly. I nodded, unsure how much I could trust my voice. I hadn't expected him to remember. I hadn't expected him to notice at all. He set his cup down. "Come sit. I'll help you." I should have refused. I should have waved him off, said I'd take something for it, that it would pass. But I didn't. Maybe because the pain was sharp that day. Maybe because something in his voice sounded more like care than suggestion. Or maybe because I wanted, desperately, to be touched with kindness. I sat on the edge of the couch, stiff and uneasy, watching as he moved around me. His hands hovered for a moment before making contact, lightly at first, then more certain. He found the muscles along my lower spine, pressing slowly, gently, in a way that sent shivers down my legs. It wasn't sensual. It wasn't even intimate in the traditional sense. It was something deeper, something human. He was present. He was listening, with his hands, with his silence. I closed my eyes. Let the moment stretch. Allowed myself to forget, for a few minutes, that I wasn't supposed to feel this way. That I was someone's wife. That he was someone else's grandson. When he finally stepped back, I opened my eyes and turned toward him. He looked down at me, not smiling, not speaking. Just watching. And then we kissed. There are no words I can give you that would explain it. No justification that would satisfy your judgment. No excuse that would redeem me. It was a kiss, not rushed, not aggressive, not planned. Just quiet and real and undeniable. The kind of kiss that makes the air feel charged, that pulls the ground a little out from under you. We pulled apart a moment later, both breathless in different ways. He stepped back again. I stood and turned away. For the rest of the day, we didn't speak about it. We moved through the house like careful strangers, avoiding shared spaces, exchanging only the briefest glances. My heart raced every time I heard his footsteps. My palms sweated when he walked past me on the stairs. At dinner, I cooked too much food. My husband complimented the seasoning, and I smiled like a mannequin. He told a story about a meeting I didn't understand, and I laughed at the right moments. All while the heat of that kiss stayed pressed against my lips like a shadow I couldn't wash off. Later that night, when the house had gone still, I stood in the bathroom brushing my hair. My reflection looked unchanged, but I felt different under the skin. Lighter and heavier at once. A woman unraveling and reforming in the same breath. I heard footsteps in the hallway. I paused, brush in midair. The door didn't open. The footsteps passed. My breath caught in my throat, and I waited until the silence returned. I slept restlessly that night. The sheets felt like paper. The bed too large. My husband snored softly beside me, one arm thrown carelessly across the pillow. He hadn't touched me in weeks. Maybe months. I didn't remember. And I didn't want to measure the distance anymore. In the morning, I woke before dawn and wandered into the kitchen. He was already there, early riser, like me. He didn't look at me when I entered, just poured me coffee like always. I took the cup, nodded a thank you. We stood together in the morning light, and I tried to remember what it felt like to be touched by him and actually feel something. The young man stayed in his room until late. I pretended not to notice. Pretended not to listen for the sound of his door opening, his footsteps on the stairs. But when I caught a glimpse of him passing by the hallway later, his eyes met mine again, and I knew nothing between us was over. I wish I could tell you that I stopped it then. That the kiss was enough to wake me up, to remind me of the boundaries I should have respected. But the truth is, it wasn't just desire. It was recognition. The kind that roots itself deep inside you, quietly, until one day you look around and realize your old life no longer fits. And once you see that, once you feel that, there's no going back. The silence between us became a presence of its own. It followed me into every room, sat beside me at meals, curled at my feet like something half tame and watching. I tried to move through the days as though they were unchanged, but nothing felt ordinary anymore. The kitchen counters seemed too clean. The ticking clock in the hallway too loud. Even the air felt different, charged, restless, as if waiting for something neither of us was willing to name. I found excuses to stay busy. I reorganized closets, washed windows that didn't need washing, baked things I had no appetite for. I wanted to fill the house with noise, motion, anything that might drown out the echo of what we'd done. But every time I turned a corner, I braced myself for the possibility of seeing him. And when I didn't, I felt disappointed. The contradiction of that made me ashamed. He, for his part, was measured. Polite. He offered to help with errands, asked if I needed anything from town, fixed a broken drawer in the guest bathroom. Always at a safe distance. Never pushing. But every now and then, I'd catch him watching me, not with longing, but with something quieter. Understanding. Like we shared a secret language built on restraint. My husband remained oblivious. He continued his routines with predictable regularity, asking about dinner while scrolling through emails, nodding absently when I answered. If he noticed that I flinched slightly when he touched my back, or that I avoided his gaze more often, he said nothing. Perhaps he'd long since stopped looking closely. One afternoon, as I was folding laundry in the upstairs hallway, I heard footsteps approaching. I didn't look up until he was beside me. He reached for a towel without speaking, helped me fold in silence. Our hands moved in rhythm, touching briefly now and then. I felt heat rise in my chest and pushed it down hard. After a moment, he said softly, "I can go, if that's easier for you." The words hit me like a gust of wind through an open door. I stopped folding and looked at him. He wasn't being dramatic. There was no bitterness in his voice. Just quiet concern. I opened my mouth to speak, then closed it. I didn't know what to say. How to explain that his absence wouldn't solve the problem. That the ache inside me had been there long before he arrived. "No," I said finally, barely above a whisper. "You don't have to go." He nodded once and returned to folding. We didn't speak again. That evening, I sat alone on the back porch while the sun dipped behind the trees. The sky was streaked with orange and lavender, and the air smelled of soil and smoke. I watched birds settle in branches, watched shadows stretch across the lawn. My thoughts unraveled in loops: guilt, want, confusion, guilt again. At some point, I heard the screen door open behind me. His footsteps were soft. He sat in the chair next to mine without a word. We didn't look at each other. We just sat, side by side, in the falling light. After a while, he said, "You don't have to be afraid of yourself." I didn't answer. I couldn't. My throat felt thick, my hands cold. The truth was, I wasn't afraid of myself. I was afraid of what I'd already let happen. And how far it might still go. Later that night, while my husband slept with the TV still buzzing faintly in the background, I stood in front of my closet for what felt like an hour. I ran my fingers across fabrics I hadn't worn in years: silks, linens, old dresses from when I still cared to impress someone. I picked out one that hadn't seen daylight in over a decade. a soft gray, with sleeves that grazed my wrists and buttons down the back. I tried it on, alone in the dark, and stared at my reflection. It still fit. Just barely. I didn't know why I did it. Maybe I needed to see if the woman I used to be was still in there somewhere, under all the years and habits and compromises. Maybe I needed to believe I hadn't completely disappeared. The next day passed in slow, uneven waves. I overcooked lunch. Forgot to check the mail. Left a pan on the stove too long and burned it. My husband noticed none of it. He was too preoccupied with a client call that dragged into the evening, too busy to see me sitting across from him at the dinner table, still wearing the gray dress under my cardigan. After he went upstairs to finish some paperwork, I wandered into the den and turned on the radio, something soft, wordless, background noise to keep me company. I sat on the couch and stared at the flickering shadows on the wall. Minutes passed. Or maybe hours. I couldn't tell anymore. Eventually, he appeared in the doorway. I didn't hear him come in. I looked up and our eyes met. He said nothing. Neither did I. But he walked over, slow and careful, and sat on the edge of the couch across from me. The room felt impossibly quiet. The only sound was the faint hiss of static behind the music. I wanted to speak. I wanted to say something that would make sense of what we were doing, something that would draw a line in the sand, or erase one already crossed. But words failed me. He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees. "You seem different lately," he said quietly. I shrugged. "Maybe I am." He didn't smile. Didn't look away. He just watched me, and I felt myself unraveling again under the weight of his attention. "I don't want to hurt you," he said. "I know." "Then tell me what you need." I looked down at my hands, folded in my lap. They looked older than I remembered. Thinner. More fragile. "I need to feel like I still matter," I said. "Like I'm not invisible." His expression softened. "You're not." I nodded, once. And then I stood. I walked past him, out of the room, up the stairs. My heart was pounding, not from fear, but from the weight of everything that was building. Everything we weren't saying. Everything that might still happen, despite our best intentions. I closed the bedroom door behind me and leaned against it, breathing hard. The house was still. The night was thick and warm, the kind that clung to your skin like memory. I didn't sleep. I just lay there, eyes open, listening to the sound of the ceiling fan, the occasional creak of floorboards, the echo of my own breath. The next day, the dress stayed in the closet. But the feeling didn't go away. There's something strange about the way ordinary life continues even when your mind is full of noise. Dishes still need washing. Mail still arrives. The sun still rises, indifferent to whatever is tearing you apart inside. And maybe that's the hardest part, that the world doesn't slow down to match your unraveling. It just keeps moving, as though nothing has changed, while you try to pretend you haven't either. The days blurred into one another, filled with polite conversations and silent calculations. I began to dread the moments when we were alone as much as I craved them. I watched the clock more than usual. Timed my movements through the house. I knew which hours he stayed in his room and which ones he lingered in the garden. I knew the sound of his footsteps. The weight of his presence behind me before he even said a word. But most of all, I knew myself, and I was beginning to fear what I was capable of. That morning started like any other. My husband had left early, his briefcase forgotten again, forcing him to return for it in a flurry of keys and half-zipped jackets. I handed it to him wordlessly, barely brushing his hand, and he muttered something resembling gratitude before rushing back out the door. I closed it behind him and stood there, listening to the silence settle around me. I turned to find the hallway empty, the staircase still. He wasn't awake yet, or if he was giving me space. That was something he had always been careful about, he never intruded. But space can become a kind of intimacy when it's shared with someone who knows how to inhabit silence with you. Later that morning, I was in the back garden, pruning roses that had grown wild from neglect. I wore gloves, but the thorns still found their way through, scratching the skin underneath. The pain was small, sharp, familiar. I welcomed it. It reminded me I was still here, still physical, still grounded in something real. He appeared behind me as I was discarding clippings into a basket. I didn't hear him approach, but I felt him, the quiet press of his presence, the pause in the air around me. "You missed one," he said gently, pointing to a branch I hadn't touched. I turned and looked at him. He wore an old flannel shirt and jeans dusted with soil. He'd been working in the side yard earlier, hauling stones for a path that no one asked him to build. I wondered if he, too, needed something to occupy his hands to keep his mind still. I glanced at the rose he mentioned and clipped it. "Thanks," I said. He nodded but didn't leave. We stood in that quiet patch of sun, surrounded by flowers and fading summer heat, neither of us sure how to break the silence without tearing something. Finally, he said, "Do you ever regret it? The life you chose?" It was a question that dropped into my chest like a stone. I blinked, unsure if I'd heard him right. But I had. And he didn't flinch. "I don't know," I said slowly. "Maybe parts of it." He nodded again, as if that answer made perfect sense. And maybe it did, to both of us. Regret isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, soft-spoken, sitting in the corners of your choices like dust you can't quite reach. He left me alone after that, and I was grateful. Not because I didn't want him near, but because I needed the space to feel the weight of that question settle in me. I returned to the house, placed the gloves by the sink, and washed my hands until the skin turned pink. The rest of the afternoon passed in restless fragments. I tried reading but couldn't focus. Tried writing a grocery list but forgot what we needed. I kept finding myself staring out the window, waiting for something I couldn't name. When the power went out just after 6, it took me a moment to register the silence. The hum of appliances disappeared. The overhead lights blinked and didn't return. I stood in the kitchen, holding a dish towel, frozen. I heard him come downstairs a few minutes later. "Breaker box looks fine," he said, stepping into the kitchen. "Might be a neighborhood outage." I nodded. "I'll light some candles." We moved around each other like dancers with a routine we hadn't rehearsed. He found matches. I placed candles in the hallway, on the kitchen table, by the living room windows. The house changed with the light, everything softer, shadows gentler, corners less defined. It felt like another world entirely, suspended from time. He brought 2 glasses of wine and set them on the table without a word. We sat down opposite each other, surrounded by flickering light, the kind that flatters everyone, softens every line. I felt like a version of myself I hadn't seen in years. We talked about nothing. Weather, errands, the strange emptiness of days that feel both too long and too short. I laughed once, and it surprised both of us. He smiled, and I looked away. At some point, the conversation trailed off. We sat in silence again, the kind that wasn't uncomfortable but full of unspoken things. I watched the flame of a candle dance in the draft, and when I looked up, his eyes were already on me. We didn't speak. We didn't move. The air between us stretched thinner and thinner until something had to give. We kissed. It happened without planning, without permission, without drama. Just the meeting of 2 people who had circled too close for too long. It was brief. Gentle. A whisper rather than a declaration. But it changed everything. When it ended, we didn't speak. He stood up, took both glasses to the sink, and disappeared up the stairs. I sat there for a long time, staring at the candle's flame, feeling my heartbeat in my throat. I didn't follow him. That night, I lay in bed beside my husband, listening to his even breathing, the rise and fall of his chest. I studied his face in the low light, the familiar lines, the soft patch of skin near his temple where his hair had thinned. I didn't feel anger or resentment. Just a quiet ache for what we had lost, for what I had found, for what I knew I couldn't keep. When I finally closed my eyes, I dreamed of nothing. Only the stillness of the house, the echo of silence that was no longer empty. There are moments that split time into before and after. Simple, quiet moments that don't seem like much as they happen, but afterward, nothing feels the same. That kiss, that second one, didn't crash down like a storm. It was barely more than a breath. But the stillness that followed wasn't peace. It was pressure. It was the air thickening with everything we couldn't take back. I avoided him the next day. I rose early, earlier than usual, and kept myself busy with the kind of tasks that required movement but no thought. I scrubbed the baseboards in the hallway, rearranged the linen closet, polished the dusty corners of the dining room chairs. I made the house shine because I couldn't let myself fall apart. He stayed in his room most of the day. Or maybe he left the house entirely, I wasn't sure. I didn't hear him, and I didn't look. But I felt his absence like a hollowed space just beyond reach, an ache that reminded me this wasn't over. Not really. My husband called around lunchtime to say he'd be home late, a meeting had run over, or traffic was bad, or both. I said all right and hung up before he could elaborate. I no longer bothered to feign curiosity about his day. We both knew what his excuses were for. Work had become the shield we both hid behind, and neither of us had the will to lower it. In the late afternoon, I stood in front of my closet again. Not for anything special. I wasn't going anywhere. But I stared at the row of clothes, the muted palette of creams and grays and tired blues. I chose a blouse I hadn't worn in years. It still smelled faintly of cedar. I pressed it with my hands, smoothing the sleeves, then pulled it on slowly, as though changing my clothes might change who I was. I wore it to dinner. Dinner, if it could be called that, was quiet. My husband scrolled through his phone between bites. I sat across from him, chewing slowly, not tasting much of anything. He commented once on the seasoning, something too salty or not salty enough, and I nodded. He didn't notice what I was wearing. He didn't notice anything. Afterward, I stood at the sink, washing the dishes one by one, letting my fingers linger under the hot water until the skin turned red. My husband had gone upstairs. The sound of the television filtered down the stairs, muffled and distant. I stood there for a long time, motionless, staring at my reflection in the darkened kitchen window. And then I heard him behind me. Not close. Not imposing. Just present. I didn't turn. I didn't have to. He stood a few feet away, silent, watching. I kept washing, slower now, more deliberate. The clink of glass against ceramic echoed in the stillness. Finally, I placed the last dish on the rack and turned off the tap. We stood there in the quiet, no words between us. I couldn't bring myself to look at him. I didn't trust what would happen if I did. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "We can't keep doing this." The words struck something sharp inside me. I turned to face him, finally. His expression was steady, calm, but there was a heaviness in his eyes that mirrored my own. "I know," I said. And I meant it. I really did. But knowing what's right and doing it are rarely the same. He took a step closer, then stopped. He didn't reach for me. He didn't plead. He just stood there, waiting, for what, I don't know. For me to push him away. For me to walk out. For something to break. Instead, I said, I don't know how to go back. He closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, he looked older, or maybe just tired. Neither do I. I moved past him, not touching, but close enough to feel the warmth of his presence. I walked through the hallway and out to the porch, needing air, needing space, needing something solid beneath my feet. The night had fallen fully now, the stars blurred behind a veil of clouds. The air was thick with summer heat, clinging to my skin like guilt. I sat on the steps, pulling my knees to my chest, and stared out at the garden. The same garden I had spent years tending, weeding, planting, watching things grow and die and return again. It felt like a metaphor, though I hated myself for thinking it. Eventually, I heard the door creak behind me. Footsteps followed. And then he was sitting beside me. We didn't speak. Not at first. We just sat there, side by side, the silence between us no longer a wall, but a bridge. Something that connected rather than divided. After a while, he said, "Do you ever wonder what it would have been like if things had been different?" I didn't answer right away. I couldn't. The question was too big, too dangerous. It reached into places I hadn't dared look. Yes, I said finally. But wondering doesn't change anything. He nodded. No. It doesn't. I looked down at my hands again, folded in my lap like they always were when I didn't know what to do. The same hands that had built a life. That had folded shirts and held crying children and tended to scraped knees and aging parents. Now trembling in the dark over something I couldn't name out loud. Then, in the stillness, I heard the one sound I had feared most. The front door. Opening. Closing. My husband's voice, calling my name. The spell shattered. I stood up too quickly, brushing my hands down the front of my blouse, suddenly aware of how close we had been sitting. He rose, too, but didn't move. I turned toward the door, heart pounding, and walked inside. My husband was in the hallway, briefcase in one hand, keys in the other. He looked tired, his shirt wrinkled, collar askew. He smiled faintly when he saw me, as if relieved. "Long day," he said. I nodded, my voice caught in my throat. "You're home early." He glanced at the clock. Traffic cleared up. I wanted to say something else, anything to ground myself. But there was nothing to say. I heard the porch steps creak behind me. A pause. Then retreating footsteps. The guest room door closing, soft and final. My husband walked past me and into the kitchen. I stood in the hallway, alone, the weight of everything pressing in from all sides. Nothing had happened, not really. But everything had already changed. The next few days unfolded like a script written in disappearing ink. I went through the motions of my life of meals, chores, small talk, with a numbness that protected me from breaking apart. My husband acted no differently. He came home at the same time, spoke about the same things, kissed me on the forehead before bed with the same distracted tenderness he'd shown for years. But I was no longer the woman who used to receive those gestures with comfort. I couldn't find her inside me anymore. And he was still here. The young man I couldn't name aloud, not even to myself. He moved through the house with a quiet respect that made it worse. He didn't push. He didn't flirt. He didn't remind me of what had happened or what nearly had. That restraint, that decency, made everything more unbearable. He was acting like nothing had changed, and yet I could feel the shift in every step I took. I avoided being alone with him, but somehow the moments found us anyway. Shared spaces. Shared silences. glances that lasted just a breath too long. When our hands brushed while reaching for the same glass, I felt it like static up my arm. When we stood beside each other in the kitchen, I measured the inches between us like a countdown. The worst part was how easily I began to need those fragments. My husband noticed none of it. Or if he did, he buried it beneath his work, his routines, the long hours and the small gestures that had once meant something but had since faded to habit. I tried not to resent him for it. Tried to remind myself that he wasn't a villain. That he hadn't done anything wrong except stop seeing me a long time ago. Still, the ache didn't go away. One evening, a storm rolled in suddenly, one of those late summer downpours that feel almost theatrical in their intensity. Thunder cracked low in the distance as the sky went from blue to slate in minutes. My husband had already left for a conference out of town, and the house felt hollow in his absence. I moved through it with restless energy, shutting windows, lighting candles just in case the power failed again. He found me in the living room, struggling with the stubborn latch on the front window. The wind had pushed it open, and rain was beginning to dot the floor beneath it. I had a towel in one hand and the frame in the other, but it wouldn't close. "Let me," he said. I stepped aside, and he leaned in, fingers finding the release mechanism with ease. The window gave, snapping shut with a finality that echoed louder than the storm. "Thanks," I said, folding the towel. We stood there for a moment, watching the rain streak down the glass, the sky flickering with distant flashes of lightning. The quiet between us was heavy, but not tense. It was something else. Something waiting. "I'm leaving tomorrow," he said suddenly. I turned toward him. "What?" "I found a place. Not far." I didn't want to say anything until it was confirmed. My mouth went dry. I searched for something to say that wouldn't sound like a protest. Something rational. Something kind. "You don't have to," I said finally. "You can stay as long as you need." "I know," he replied. "But it's time." I nodded. It was the right decision. We both knew that. But I felt the ground shift beneath me just the same. "I'll miss seeing you in the mornings," he said, almost like a confession. "Before everything wakes up." I looked down at my hands, then back out at the rain. "Mornings are quieter than they used to be." "They're better," he said. "Because of you." My heart clenched. I didn't want him to say more. And I didn't want him to stop. We didn't speak again for the rest of the night. He went to his room. I went to mine. The storm continued until well past midnight. I lay in bed listening to it, eyes wide open, thoughts circling like water down a drain. I kept imagining him packing. Folding clothes. Emptying drawers. Leaving. And with every imagined movement, something inside me began to unravel. The next morning, the house was cool and gray, the kind of morning that smells of wet leaves and change. I found him in the kitchen, already dressed, a duffel bag at his feet. He was pouring coffee, his usual mug, the one he'd used since day one. I don't know why that detail undid me, but it did. I poured a cup for myself and sat down across from him. We didn't say much. Just sipped in silence, the way we had done so many times before, as if it had always been part of our routine. But it wasn't. It had started quietly, unexpectedly, and now it was ending the same way. He stood first. Picked up his bag. Slung it over his shoulder. "I left my number," he said. "Just in case you ever want to check in." I nodded. I didn't trust my voice. Then he walked to the door, paused, and looked back. "You matter," he said. "More than you know." Then he was gone. I sat at the table for a long time after that, the coffee growing cold in my hands. The house was too quiet. Not peaceful. Just empty. That afternoon, I tried to clean. To restore the sense of order that had once soothed me. I changed the sheets in the guest room, folded his laundry, vacuumed the hall where his shoes had always sat. I told myself it was just housekeeping. That it didn't mean anything. But everything I touched carried a memory. Later, I found myself standing at the bottom of the stairs, staring up at the empty landing. There was no sound. No presence. Just the distant creak of the house settling and the hum of my thoughts, loud and relentless. When my husband returned that evening, I was in the kitchen. He greeted me with a kiss on the cheek, noticed the storm had passed, mentioned traffic. I responded automatically. Polite. Predictable. Safe. He didn't ask about the guest room. He didn't ask about anything. And I didn't offer. Because I knew what I had done. And more than that, I knew what I had wanted. The house was quieter without him. Not in the peaceful way, but in the kind of silence that made me feel like I was listening for something I would never hear again. The rooms didn't echo exactly, but they felt different, heavier in some places, hollow in others. I moved through them carefully, as if not to wake something I had left sleeping. He had taken his things. All of them. There were no forgotten socks under the bed, no toothbrush left in the guest bathroom. Just absence, arranged neatly where presence used to be. I tried to ignore it. I tried to focus on routine. I returned to the grocery store at my usual time, refilled the bird feeder in the garden, even called my sister for a conversation that felt rehearsed. But everything felt like mimicry, a version of myself I was only pretending to still be. I smiled at the cashier and thanked the delivery boy, but my voice felt distant in my own ears. My husband noticed, in his own way. He started paying more attention. Small things. He brought home flowers one evening, pale yellow tulips, and placed them on the counter like a peace offering for something he didn't know had been broken. I thanked him. I even arranged them in a vase. But I couldn't stop thinking about how the petals looked like they were already wilting. He offered to take me away for the weekend, just the two of us. Maybe a change of scenery would do us good. I said yes before thinking it through. I think I was hoping that maybe, if I stepped outside the walls where everything had happened, I could leave something behind. We drove out to a rental cabin by a lake, one he had found last minute on a travel site. It was pleasant enough, clean, quiet, surrounded by trees and water and the hum of insects. It looked like the kind of place we should have loved years ago, when we still made time for late dinners and unplanned walks. The first night, we sat on the porch with glasses of wine, watching the light change on the water. He talked more than usual, about work, about people I didn't know, about how he wished we did this more often. I listened. Nodded. Tried to stay present. At some point, he reached over and put his hand on mine. His skin was warm, familiar. I didn't pull away. But I didn't feel what I thought I would feel. No spark of comfort. No ache of nostalgia. Just the weight of a gesture that once meant everything and now meant mostly habit. He looked at me and said softly, "I know I haven't been around much. I've been distracted. But I want to change that." I nodded again, unsure what to say. My throat tightened. I wanted to be grateful. I wanted to reach for him. I wanted to remember what it felt like to love him like I used to. But the truth sat bitter at the back of my mouth. Not because of him. Not really. But because too much time had passed with us looking in different directions. That night, in bed, he tried to hold me. I let him. His arms around me felt safe, but they didn't feel like home. They didn't quiet the noise in my head or still the restlessness in my chest. I lay awake long after he'd fallen asleep, staring into the darkness, wondering what kind of woman lets something break without trying harder to fix it. The next morning, I got up early and walked down to the lake alone. The air was damp, the grass still soaked from overnight rain. I stood at the edge of the water, arms crossed, watching small ripples reach for the shore and pull back again. I thought about how many versions of myself I had left behind. The girl I was before marriage. The young wife who tried too hard. The woman who accepted silence as normal. The one who found herself wanting something she shouldn't want. They were all standing behind me like shadows, none of them able to explain what I had become. When we returned home Sunday evening, the house greeted us with a cold kind of stillness. As I carried my bag upstairs, I passed the guest room. The door was closed, as it had been since he left, and I felt something tighten in my chest. That night, I stood in the kitchen alone while my husband read in the living room. I looked out the window into the backyard, the light from the porch casting long shapes across the patio. I wondered where he was now. If he'd unpacked. If he'd thought about me. If he regretted anything. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. My husband was still asleep, one arm flung across the blanket, his mouth slightly open. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the floor. Eventually, I got dressed and went downstairs. The house was quiet, but not empty, it still carried everything that had happened, like dust in the corners. I stood in the hallway for a long time before I did it. Before I walked into the guest room. It was clean. Neat. Exactly as I'd left it after he'd gone. But the moment I stepped inside, something shifted. The air felt different. My hand drifted to the back of the chair, then to the edge of the dresser. I opened the top drawer without thinking. It was empty. I closed it again. On the desk, a small envelope I hadn't noticed before. Folded once. Unmarked. I picked it up with trembling fingers and opened it slowly. Inside, a single line, written in handwriting I knew too well. I never wanted to make it harder for you. No name. No signature. Nothing else. I stared at it for a long time. I didn't cry. I didn't crumble. I just felt still. Because he hadn't made it harder. Not really. I had done that to myself. In the days that followed, I kept the envelope tucked inside the drawer of my nightstand, folded neatly between two books I never finished. I didn't read it again. I didn't need to. The words were branded in my mind, as familiar now as the sound of my own name. I never wanted to make it harder for you. But that's exactly what he had done, whether he meant to or not by forcing, not by pursuing, but simply by seeing me when no one else did. The rest of the world, meanwhile, moved on with startling ease. My husband went back to his meetings and morning routines. The house returned to its rhythm of soft clinks, floor creaks, and conversations that filled time more than they shared meaning. I answered questions with just enough enthusiasm. I smiled when prompted. I made the bed each morning and turned down the covers each night, as though nothing had changed. But inside, I was learning how to live in two worlds at once, the one where nothing had happened, and the one where everything had. Sometimes, in the middle of washing dishes or folding laundry, I would find myself pausing, hand in mid-air, staring at a spot where he used to stand. Not because I missed him, exactly. It wasn't that simple. It was more that something in me had been stirred awake, and now I didn't know how to lull it back to sleep. It wasn't about romance. It wasn't even about attraction anymore. It was about attention. About being witnessed in full, without judgment or expectation. About being a person, not a function. One afternoon, I went into the garage to retrieve an old box of winter coats. The seasons were starting to shift, slowly, subtly, and I needed to prepare. As I lifted the box down from the shelf, something slipped from the top and landed on the concrete floor with a dull thud. I crouched to pick it up. It was a small, framed photo. One of those casual snapshots my husband had taken years ago during a weekend trip. I remembered the moment. I had been laughing at something just off camera, wearing a scarf that kept flying into my face. The angle wasn't flattering, the lighting was poor, but my expression was genuine. He must have printed it, tucked it away, and forgotten. I stood there for a long moment, holding it. Looking at her. That woman in the frame. I could barely remember what she had been thinking at the time, what her worries were, what she wanted. But I remembered how she felt, light, open, expectant. Like something might still happen, something worth waiting for. I took the photo inside and placed it face down on my dresser. That evening, my husband suggested we invite a couple from his office for dinner. "It's been a while since we had people over," he said casually, sipping his tea. "Might be nice to entertain again." I said yes. Because I always did. The day of the dinner, I spent hours preparing. The kitchen filled with the smell of herbs and roast chicken, fresh bread, lemon tarts. I set the table with the good china, the one we rarely used. I ironed the cloth napkins, polished the silver, lit candles just before the doorbell rang. Our guests were pleasant. Polished. They laughed easily, complimented everything, made harmless conversation about vacation plans and home improvements. My husband was charming, just as he always was in social settings. He filled the room with stories, gestured when he spoke, refilled glasses without needing to be asked. I watched him from across the table and tried to recall when we had last spoken like that, with energy, with interest. I tried to remember the last time he'd asked me something and waited for a real answer. Later, after they left and I was stacking plates in the sink, he came up behind me and placed his hands on my shoulders. "That went well," he said. "You were wonderful." I nodded, smiling tightly. "Thanks. I've missed this," he added, squeezing gently. "Us. Like this." I froze for just a second, then resumed rinsing the dishes. I wasn't sure what like this meant anymore. I wasn't sure he knew either. That night, I sat on the edge of the bed long after he'd fallen asleep. I ran my thumb along the edge of the photo I'd placed back on my dresser, still face down. I didn't want to look at it, but I couldn't put it away. It wasn't a reminder of what I'd lost, it was a reminder of what I'd let fade without even realizing it. The next morning, a package arrived. Just a small box, addressed to me, no return label. I carried it into the kitchen and opened it carefully, my hands already tingling with nerves. Inside was a single paperback book. One I had mentioned in passing months ago, during one of our quieter conversations, a novel I'd loved in my 20s but never owned. I opened the front cover and found a small inscription, written in that same steady handwriting. "You remembered who you were. Don't forget now." No signature. I closed the book and pressed it to my chest. It felt like a parting gift, though I wasn't sure if he meant it that way. Maybe it was closure. Maybe it was just a final kindness. But it cracked something in me wide open. Because I didn't know how to live in this house anymore, not entirely. I didn't know how to move forward without dragging behind me the ghost of that brief, impossible truth, that I had been seen, had been known, in a way I hadn't for years. I sat at the kitchen table and stared out the window. The garden needed weeding. The laundry needed folding. The man upstairs needed breakfast. And I needed to find a way to live with everything I hadn't said. I don't know when I stopped looking forward to the days. It wasn't sudden. It crept in quietly, like fog drifting under a door, until one morning I realized I was going through the motions without ever asking myself why. Wake up, make coffee, fold clothes, nod at words. A life made of habits, not meaning. The kind of life that feels full because it's never still long enough to be questioned. But after he left, after everything, the stillness returned. Not the kind that soothes. The kind that reveals. The kind that demands you look at the shape of your life and ask yourself how you ended up living in a version that feels like someone else's. The book stayed on my nightstand for days. I didn't open it again. I didn't need to. I knew every word written inside the front cover. Not because I had memorized it, but because it had etched itself into me. You remembered who you were. Don't forget now. It haunted me, not because of who sent it, but because I didn't know how to answer it. Because maybe I didn't remember. Or maybe I did, and I just didn't know what to do with her, that other version of me who used to believe in possibility. That week, I caught my reflection more than usual. In windows, in mirrors, even in the glossy metal of the kettle. It wasn't vanity. It was curiosity. I kept wondering who I looked like, the woman I had become, or the one I used to be. I tried to reclaim pieces of myself. I rearranged the furniture in the guest room. Not out of necessity, but to change the feel of it. I opened the windows more often, let in air that hadn't passed through the same filters. I started taking walks alone again, long and aimless, sometimes without my phone. I didn't go far, just enough to be away. On one of those walks, I passed a small shop I'd forgotten existed. It sold books, candles, old records. I stood outside for a long time before going in. The scent of aged paper and sandalwood wrapped around me like a coat I hadn't worn in years. The woman behind the counter looked up and smiled. I smiled back, polite but distant. I wasn't ready to be seen. Not yet. I browsed in silence. Picked up a few paperbacks I'd never heard of. Turned one over in my hands, pretending to read the back. I didn't buy anything. I just needed to remember what it felt like to want something. That night, back home, I made dinner alone. My husband was working late, as usual. I didn't mind. I sliced vegetables with steady hands, poured wine I wouldn't finish, set one place at the table. I ate in silence. Not sad. Not lonely. Just present. Afterward, I went upstairs and opened my closet. I pulled out an old box of scarves, ones I hadn't worn in years. I used to love scarves. Used to believe they made me feel more complete, somehow. Like a final detail that said I hadn't stopped paying attention. I tried one on, deep burgundy, soft wool, and looked in the mirror. The woman looking back at me was older, thinner around the mouth, but not gone. Downstairs, I heard the door open. My husband had come home. He called my name, as he always did. I answered from the top of the stairs. He stepped into view, his eyes briefly scanning me before settling. A small smile crossed his face. "That scarf looks nice on you," he said. "Thanks," I replied, surprised that he noticed. He didn't say anything else. Just disappeared into the kitchen, likely to reheat whatever I had left him. I sat on the edge of the bed, still wearing the scarf. I didn't know what I wanted from him. Maybe nothing. Maybe just acknowledgement that I still existed in more than just function. Later that week, I was cleaning out the upstairs hallway closet when I came across something unexpected, a box I hadn't seen in years. Tucked behind old pillows, dusty photo frames, and the kind of forgotten junk that accumulates in the corners of a long marriage. I pulled it out and opened it on the floor. Inside were letters. Dozens of them. From the early years of our relationship. Notes left on counters. Pages torn from notebooks. Cards from birthdays, anniversaries, trips. His handwriting, younger and more certain, filled the pages with affection I'd forgotten existed. Promises. Jokes. Tiny declarations of how much he'd loved me. I sat cross-legged, the box beside me, reading one after another. At first, it felt like archaeology. Then like eavesdropping on strangers. And then, slowly, painfully, like remembering. We had loved each other. Fiercely, once. Fully. I had just let it fade without tending. That night, I placed a single letter on his pillow. No explanation. Just a gesture. I wanted to see if he would remember what it meant. The next morning, he didn't mention it. But the letter was gone. That same day, while sorting through mail in the kitchen, I noticed something unusual. An envelope addressed to me, handwritten, but unfamiliar. No return address. Inside was a photograph. Not of us. Of me. Taken from behind, standing at the end of the dock near the lake. From the weekend trip. I hadn't seen anyone there, hadn't known a photo was taken. But there I was, alone, wrapped in my coat, scarf fluttering behind me in the wind. No note. Just the image. I stared at it for what felt like hours. Not because of what it meant. But because of what it didn't. Someone had seen me when I thought I was alone. And even now, weeks later, that quiet seeing echoed louder than all the words that had gone unspoken in my home for years. I placed the photo in a drawer. Not hidden. Not framed. Just kept. Because I didn't know yet what to do with it. But I knew I couldn't throw it away. It's strange how life returns to its shape, even when you know that shape will never fit the same way again. I moved through my days with careful attention, aware that this was the ending, not of my marriage, or my responsibilities, but of the story I'd been telling myself for years. The story of the quiet wife, the invisible woman, the one who kept her feelings so tightly pressed she forgot they existed. The photograph in the drawer became a secret I didn't try to solve. I didn't ask my husband if he took it, though a part of me knew he hadn't. I didn't wonder if it was left by accident or intention. I just let it sit, a silent witness to a version of myself I had only glimpsed when I thought no one was watching. My husband became gentler, in ways that were both welcome and foreign. He lingered in the mornings, pouring coffee for both of us instead of just himself. He asked about my days, really asked, and sometimes, if he sensed I needed space, he gave it without comment. There were more flowers, more small kindnesses. For a while, it almost felt like we were relearning how to be together. Or maybe learning for the first time. We didn't talk about the past. Not about the guest who stayed, or the weeks when the house felt like it was waiting for something to break. We didn't speak of the ways we had drifted, or of the things we had both done, or not done, to reach this quiet, uncertain peace. There was a mutual understanding in our silence. Neither of us wanted to break what had finally settled. But some things can't be unlearned. I found myself watching him as he moved through the house, noticing the new lines in his face, the way he fumbled for words he never used to forget. I found myself wondering if he, too, was haunted by the people we used to be. If he thought about what it meant to forgive, or to be forgiven. One evening, we sat in the living room, reading in companionable silence. The sun set behind the trees, painting the walls gold and pink. I glanced at him over the rim of my glasses and caught him watching me. Not the way he used to, not with hunger or longing, but with something softer. A kind of recognition. He smiled and reached for my hand. I let him take it, and for a long time, we just sat there, palms pressed together, feeling the pulse of old love, not urgent but real. There were setbacks. Nights when I couldn't sleep, when I lay awake replaying everything that had happened, everything I'd felt and said and not said. There were days when the house felt too small, when I ached for a conversation that would never happen again, for a kind of seeing that could only exist in the past. But those moments grew less frequent. Slowly, I learned to be gentle with myself. To understand that regret and hope can live side by side. I started going out more. Walks in the park, a visit to a gallery with an old friend, a lunch alone in a busy cafe. I found myself drawn to quiet spaces, places where no one knew me, where I could be just another woman lost in thought. I bought myself small gifts, a book of poems, a new plant for the windowsill, a pair of earrings I didn't need. I learned, slowly, that I could give myself permission to want, and to choose, and to begin again, even in small ways. My husband and I took another trip to the lake. This time, it was easier. We didn't pretend. We didn't force conversations or chase after feelings that weren't there. We simply existed side by side, watching the water, breathing the same air. He held my hand as we walked the shore. I leaned into his arm, letting myself be held without needing to disappear. One morning, I woke before dawn and watched the sky lighten through the bedroom window. I thought about the years behind me, the mistakes, the joys, the things I'd lost and found. I thought about him, about the guest who left, about the part of me that had been seen and known for a little while. I didn't regret what had happened. I didn't glorify it, either. I accepted it as part of my story, not the end or the beginning, but a chapter that made the others more true. I went downstairs and found my husband in the kitchen, humming softly as he poured water for tea. He looked up and smiled, a small, tired, real smile. I smiled back. For the first time in a long time, I felt something like peace. I opened the drawer and took out the photograph. I held it in my hand, tracing the edges with my thumb. Then, slowly, I let it go. Placed it in a box with the old scarves, the letters, the fragments of other lives I had lived. Not to hide it, not to forget. Just to give it a place among everything else that had made me. We ate breakfast together, quietly. The day began again. And I began again, too, not as someone new, but as myself. Just myself. This is where it ends. Not with a revelation, not with forgiveness or forgetting, but with the quiet certainty that I have survived my own story, and that, in the end, I am still here.